In the beginning, the world of ancient Egypt was a place where the air itself seemed to hum with the presence of gods. The Nile flowed like a vein through the body of the kingdom, feeding not only the land but the spiritual hunger of its people. The temples were not merely buildings, they were living organisms, breathing incense, echoing with chants, pulsing with gold, blood, and belief. Within their stone walls, men walked as intermediaries between heaven and earth, men called priests, chosen not by accident, but by fate. To the ordinary Egyptian, they were the purest of mortals, guardians of Ma'at, the divine balance that kept the world from descending into chaos. Yet behind their sacred masks, some of these men carried desires so dark, so consuming, that even the gods they served might have turned away in silence. The story begins in the heart of Thebes, where towering obelisks caught the first light of dawn. Inside the temple of Ammonius, rituals of morning purification unfolded with mechanical perfection. The priests bathed in holy water, anointed their skin with oils, and recited hymns that had echoed unchanged for centuries. To an observer, it was the image of perfect order. But beneath this serenity lay something more human, something forbidden. For to serve the gods was to deny oneself, to cage the body so that the soul might ascend. And the longer a man denied, the more the body demanded its due. Egypt's high priests were not simply men of faith, they were men of power. They controlled land, grain, and wealth beyond measure. The pharaoh himself relied on their blessing to maintain his rule, and in that delicate balance, the line between devotion and dominance began to blur. Power is intoxicating, and when coupled with divine sanction, it becomes irresistible. To touch the sacred was to touch eternity, but what happens when one begins to believe that they, too, are divine? That their desires are not sins, but sacred impulses placed by the gods themselves? The temples became stages for this silent transformation. Behind veils of incense and chants, certain rituals took on meanings far removed from their original purpose. The sacred marriage of god and goddess, once symbolic, began to find expression in the flesh. The act of worship became indistinguishable from the act of desire. These were not the open orgies of Rome or Greece, they were secret, encoded in liturgy, masked in devotion. Every movement, every whisper, every offering carried two meanings, one for the faithful, one for the initiated. To the common people, the priests remained the embodiment of purity. They spoke with the voice of the gods, performed miracles of healing, and read the signs of the heavens. Yet within the sacred chambers, the same hands that poured libations to Ammonius might trace the curves of a forbidden body. The paradox was complete. Holiness demanded self-control, but control created hunger, and hunger, left unchecked, birthed the darkest kind of worship. The heart of ancient Egypt thrived on contrast, life and death, creation and destruction, order and chaos. The priests embodied this balance, believing that to know light, one must also walk through shadow. And so they did. Their temples were sanctuaries of faith by day and vaults of secrecy by night. What occurred in the innermost sanctum, where only the high priest and the statue of the god might meet, was a mystery even to those who served beside him. Some said the god entered him. Others whispered that he became the god. Either way, something happened in that darkness that no mortal should have witnessed. As the narrator's voice fades, the viewer is left with the image of a single candle flickering against a wall of hieroglyphs, symbols of purity, carved by men who knew desire. The camera lingers on the contrast, the gold of divinity and the red of flesh, the silence of devotion and the breath of temptation. In this world, sin was not the opposite of holiness. It was its reflection, distorted, forbidden, and utterly human. By the time the introduction ends, one truth becomes clear. The story of Egypt's high priests is not simply about lust or corruption. It is about the fragile boundary between the sacred and the profane, the eternal human struggle to control the fire within. When the gods demand desire, even the purest hearts may burn. The life of Egypt's high priests was one of sacred contradiction, a world where purity and temptation lived side by side, separated only by a whisper of ritual. From the outside, they appeared as paragons of virtue, clothed in white linen, their heads shaved as a sign of spiritual cleanliness. They rose before dawn to bathe in sacred pools, cleanse their bodies with natron, and prepare the daily offerings to the gods. Every motion was dictated by ancient law: how they walked, how they spoke, even how they breathed in the presence of the divine. But beneath this choreography of holiness, another rhythm pulsed, the quiet heartbeat of power, privilege, and unspoken hunger. The Egyptian priesthood was not a monastic order of humble servants. It was an elite class, a spiritual aristocracy that controlled the invisible levers of the kingdom. Temples were not just places of worship, they were economic empires. Each temple owned fields, livestock, ships, and slaves. Offerings from the faithful, tribute from conquered lands, and gifts from the pharaoh filled their treasuries with gold and grain. The priests of Ammonius at Thebes were among the wealthiest men in the world, their influence rivaling even the throne itself. The more divine authority they claimed, the more human power they amassed. And power, when wrapped in sanctity, becomes the most dangerous kind of illusion. Their daily lives were a blend of the sacred and the sensuous. The scent of lotus oil filled the corridors of stone. Hymns echoed like slow incantations, vibrating through the bodies of those who chanted them. The act of worship was not dry or intellectual. It was tactile, emotional, even erotic in its intensity. The priests believed that to serve the gods was to participate in creation itself, to keep the divine cycle of life and fertility alive through ritual. In their worldview, desire was not inherently evil. It was divine energy, the essence that made the universe move. But when that belief met human ambition, it twisted into something darker. Behind the closed doors of the inner sanctum, only the highest priests were allowed entry. They claimed to commune directly with the gods, to channel their will into the world of men. Yet this proximity to the divine blurred the line between servant and deity. The high priests began to see themselves not as intermediaries, but as living embodiments of the gods they served. And in this self-deification lay the seed of their downfall. If the gods' desires were their own, then nothing was forbidden. What began as symbolic rituals soon became personal indulgence, justified by divine authority. The paradox of the Egyptian faith was that purity required the constant awareness of impurity. The priests spent their lives avoiding defilement. No contact with the dead, no sexual act before ritual, no impure food or drink. Yet in that relentless discipline grew an obsession with what must never be touched. The forbidden became magnetic. The more they cleansed, the more they craved what they could not have. Desire fed upon denial until even the most devout among them began to dream of sacred transgressions. The hierarchy of the priesthood deepened this divide. At the bottom were the wab priests, ordinary servants who maintained temple cleanliness and prepared offerings. Above them were the lector priests, guardians of sacred words and magic. Then came the prophets and high priests, the true wielders of spiritual and political power. Their status gave them access not only to the gods, but to those who served within the temple, singers, dancers, and sacred maidens. These women were dedicated to the gods, chosen for their beauty and voice, their presence meant to please the divine senses. Yet in the secrecy of temple life, many became the instruments of pleasure for mortal priests who believed themselves to be divine. Egyptian religion was built on balance, ma'at, the eternal order. Every act of chaos, every indulgence, every sin was a threat to this fragile harmony. But what happens when those sworn to maintain balance become the source of its decay? Inscriptions and later writings hint at moments when the priesthood grew corrupt, when wealth replaced faith and ritual became spectacle. Pharaohs began to sense the danger, that the temple, once a place of divine unity, was turning into a fortress of personal power. Some kings, like Akhenaten, tried to break that power by erasing Ammonius' name, by silencing the priests who had become too strong. But history suggests that even divine reformers cannot purge desire, they can only drive it deeper underground. To understand the hidden life of Egypt's holy men, one must look not only at their rituals but at their psychology. They lived under impossible pressure, to be more than human, to act as the voice of gods yet never feel as men. The result was spiritual claustrophobia. In the quiet of the temple corridors, beneath the chants and incense, a question whispered through their hearts. If the gods made us in their image, do they not also share our desires? It was this question, subtle, blasphemous, irresistible, that turned devotion into temptation. By the end of this section, the audience sees the high priests not as distant figures of marble and gold, but as human beings trapped within their own sanctity. Their robes of linen and their vows of purity become symbols of repression, beautiful, holy, and suffocating. The foundation is laid for what comes next. How these men, believing themselves to be the chosen voices of the gods, began to interpret desire not as sin, but as sacred language. And in that moment of divine justification, the gates of moral decay swung open. There is a certain moment, when incense thickens the air and the flicker of flame dances upon gilded walls, that worship ceases to feel like prayer and begins to feel like possession. In ancient Egypt, this was the moment the priests called Heka, the divine magic of creation, when mortal and God could merge through ritual. To outsiders, it was piety. To those inside the temple, it was something far more intoxicating, the transformation of faith into sensual experience. Within this delicate balance between sacred duty and physical ecstasy lay the secret life of Egypt's high priests, men who believed that to touch the divine, they must awaken the flesh. The heart of this belief came from Egypt's oldest myths. In the story of Isis and Osiris, the goddess resurrects her murdered husband not through prayer, but through intimacy. She gathers the scattered pieces of his body and, through an act both erotic and divine, conceives Horus, the son of resurrection. To the Egyptian mind, creation itself was an act of love, of union. The cosmos was born from desire. And so the priests, interpreters of that divine order, believed that to maintain the balance of life and death, they too must reenact the sacred act of creation. The body was no longer seen as corrupt, but as a temple, a vessel of divine energy. Inside the great sanctuaries of Thebes and Heliopolis, this theology was more than philosophy, it was performance. The rituals of fertility were carried out in chambers where only the initiated could enter. The high priest would stand before the statue of the god, often gilded, adorned with gems, its eyes inlaid with obsidian to reflect the candlelight, and recite hymns invoking fertility, renewal, and divine passion. The air trembled with drums and chanting. The sacred dancers moved like living hieroglyphs, each gesture a word in an ancient language of desire. The priest, possessed by divine fervor, would anoint the idol with oils and perfumes, a symbolic act of union between God and servant. But symbolism has power. Over time, the act became literal. When the priests believed that a god could inhabit their body, they began to see themselves as the physical extension of that deity's will. The pleasures of the body, once forbidden, were reinterpreted as offerings, the divine experiencing itself through human form. The boundary between ritual and indulgence dissolved completely. What was once meant to honor the gods became a stage for human longing, cloaked in holy words. There were festivals in Egypt where this union was celebrated openly. During the festival of Hathor, goddess of love and intoxication, music and wine flowed freely. Women, dressed as priestesses, danced with golden sistrums, their movements meant to mirror the trembling of creation. The night pulsed with laughter, perfume, and a sense of something ancient awakening. Yet behind that joy was the darker truth, that pleasure, once unleashed in the name of divinity, cannot easily be contained. The priests, trained to restrain their desires, found themselves consumed by them. The temple became a paradox, a house of the gods filled with the whispers of mortal hunger. The rituals of Ammonius in particular carried a deeper, more secret meaning. In certain ceremonies known only to the high initiates, the priest was said to become the living body of Ammonius himself. When temple maidens, singers of the god, entered to perform their sacred songs, their role was more than musical. Their beauty was seen as the reflection of divine harmony, their bodies as instruments of the god's creative force. Some texts and later writings hint that these encounters were not merely symbolic. Under the veil of ritual, acts of passion unfolded, justified as divine communion. For the priests, to resist was to deny the God within, to indulge was to serve him. The sensory detail of these ceremonies was overwhelming. The The flicker of torches painted the walls with moving shadows of gods and beasts. The scent of myrrh and cinnamon clung to the skin. Gold jewelry chimed softly as dancers moved in hypnotic rhythm. The priests chanted in voices that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth, their eyes wide, their breath quickening as if possessed. In this charged atmosphere, the human body became both altar and sacrifice. Pleasure was no longer sin. It was liturgy, the language through which mortals could touch eternity. Yet the danger of sanctified desire is that it demands no limit. What begins as ritual ecstasy can easily become obsession. The priests who once sought the divine through passion began to crave the passion itself, mistaking the thrill of the body for the presence of the god. Some believed that by uniting physically with those consecrated to the divine, singers, dancers, or even novices, they could channel the god's vitality, absorb their life force. What had once been holy imitation became blasphemous indulgence. The gods were no longer worshipped, they were impersonated. But even in this descent, there was method, a logic of sin disguised as faith. To the priest, every forbidden act could be rationalized as sacred necessity. The fertility of the Nile depended on the union of heaven and earth, god and goddess, male and female. To reenact that balance was to sustain the cosmos itself. Desire was no longer personal, it was cosmic duty. That was the illusion that allowed their transgressions to flourish in silence, unseen and unpunished. Outside the temple, the people still prayed, still believed. They saw the processions, the golden barks carried through the streets, the priests shimmering in white linen under the sun. They could not see what happened behind the veil, the trembling hands, the whispered invocations, the blurred faces of devotion and desire. To them, the gods were eternal and pure. They did not know that the men who served them were becoming something else, something trapped between holiness and hunger. By the end of this chapter, the tone turns darker, more intimate. The sacred world of Egypt has revealed its secret heart, where the act of creation became indistinguishable from the act of seduction. The viewer is left with an image both beautiful and unsettling, a priest before the statue of his god, eyes closed, breath unsteady, whispering a prayer that sounds almost like a confession. In that moment, worship and lust are the same thing, two halves of the same forbidden flame. In the golden heart of Thebes rose a city of silence and shadows, the seat of the god Ammonius, the hidden one. His temples towered like mountains of devotion, but inside them ruled men whose power was anything but hidden. They were the high priests of Ammonius, the most exalted order in Egypt, men who spoke in the name of gods and whispered in the ears of kings. To the world, they were the guardians of the sacred flame. But behind the veil of incense and stone, their hands held not only the tools of ritual but the instruments of domination, desire, and secrecy. Their rise began in the turbulent centuries after Egypt's golden age. Pharaohs weakened, dynasties fractured, and the temples filled the void. As royal authority faltered, the priests of Ammonius gathered power like desert sand in a storm. They controlled the flow of offerings, dictated the calendar of festivals, and owned vast lands that stretched beyond sight. Their wealth rivaled the royal treasury, their influence shaped policy, war, and the very interpretation of the divine will. To defy them was to defy the gods themselves. And in a land where every breath was shadowed by the afterlife, such defiance was unthinkable. The chief among them, the high priest of Ammonius at Karnak, was more than a religious figure. He was the unseen pharaoh, ruling not by decree, but by faith. He wore robes of immaculate linen, his head shaved smooth, his skin perfumed with sacred oils that glimmered in torchlight. When he entered the sanctuary, even the lesser priests bowed until their foreheads touched the floor. The people believed that when he spoke, Ammonius spoke through him. But in that belief lay a perilous temptation. For what man, when called the vessel of a god, can resist believing it? The transformation from servant to deity was subtle at first. The rituals that once honored Ammonius became centered on the high priest himself. During the Feast of Opet, when the statue of Ammonius was carried from Karnak to Luxor, crowds gathered in ecstatic reverence. They threw flowers, cried out prayers, and reached trembling hands toward the golden bark. But many of those prayers were directed not at the silent effigy of the god, but at the man who carried his voice. The high priest's gaze became the gaze of Ammonius. His touch, the touch of the divine. And in that blurring of boundaries, power became sanctified lust. It was said that during the nocturnal ceremonies, rites performed deep within the temple's innermost chambers, the high priest communed with the god in solitude. Only the sound of chanting and the faint shimmer of torches marked the passage of the night. But rumors whispered through the corridors that the god did not come to the priest as a vision or a voice, but as a presence that overtook his body. In that possession, the man was no longer himself. He became the incarnation of Ammonius, free from mortal law, free from moral constraint. Whatever he desired in that state was, by definition, the will of the god. The dancers and temple maidens who served in these rituals knew this transformation well. Chosen for their beauty and grace, they were called daughters of Ammonius, devoted to serve the god through song, movement, and fragrance. Yet many came to understand that the god they served had the face of a man robed in holiness, whose desires were hidden behind scripture. Some were treated with reverence, others with cruelty disguised as sanctity. In their eyes, the union was sacred. To the priests, it was necessity. The divine energy had to be renewed through flesh. The higher their rank, the more divine their justification. Over time, the rites became more elaborate, more indulgent. Gold and wine replaced modest offerings. The priests' quarters filled with luxuries that rivaled the pharaoh's palace. Silks from the east, incense from Punt, even rare aphrodisiacs believed to awaken the god within. During the festival of the valley, when the spirits of the dead were honored, the high priest would lead processions by day and vanish into the sanctum by night. There, among the murmurs of hymns and the scent of burning myrrh, acts were performed that no scroll would ever record. The priests called it divine union. History would call it desecration. But the most dangerous corruption was not of the body, it was of the soul. The high priests began to see themselves as the rightful rulers of Egypt, chosen by Ammonius to govern the land in the pharaoh's absence. They controlled oracles, decided omens, and manipulated the will of the gods to suit political ambitions. A pharaoh who displeased them might receive a prophecy of doom, one who obeyed would be promised eternal favor. Theocracy became tyranny cloaked in ritual. Every word, every act, every desire was justified by divine authority. The gods were no longer beyond the priests, they were within them. Yet even as their power grew, so did the rot beneath it. Whispers spread among lower priests and scribes, tales of secret orgies disguised as fertility rites, of forbidden liaisons with consecrated women, of sacrifices made not for faith but for pleasure. Some claimed to have heard strange cries echoing through the sanctum long after midnight, others saw the high priest emerge trembling, eyes wide with the mania of possession. Whether the god had truly entered him or whether he had surrendered to madness, no one could tell. But the illusion held, for to question it was heresy. And in Egypt, heresy was death. The priest's power reached its zenith when the line between God and man vanished completely. In temple inscriptions, their titles grew grander: Beloved of Ammonius, Voice of the Hidden One, He who breathes the breath of the god. Statues depicted them not as humble servants, but as radiant beings with divine crowns and muscular perfection. Art itself became propaganda, erasing the boundaries between faith and flesh. The people bowed before their images as they once had before pharaohs, unaware that the true god being worshipped was human vanity. But divine arrogance always carries a price. As the priests tightened their grip on Egypt's soul, the kingdom began to fracture. Kings resented their influence, soldiers despised their opulence. In the shadows, the gods of vengeance stirred. The Nile's floods grew unpredictable, the harvests thinner. The people began to whisper that Ammonius had turned his face away, that his priests had offended him with secret sins. The same rituals that once promised fertility now reeked of decay. In the name of divine union, the high priests had brought about divine wrath. By the end of this section, the viewer sees the temple of Ammonius not as a house of worship but as a gilded cage, a place where men believed themselves to be gods and were devoured by that illusion. The sensual rituals of earlier ages have now become instruments of control, the sacred ecstasies, a weapon of politics. Power and lust have fused into a single, dangerous force. And as the high priests stand at the height of their glory, they are already standing on the edge of ruin, blind to the abyss opening beneath their feet. There were women in ancient Egypt whose beauty was said to soothe even the wrath of the gods. They were the temple maidens, the singers of the god, the sacred dancers of Hathor, Batet, and Ammonius, chosen from youth, trained in purity, music, and devotion. To the common people, they were divine intermediaries, embodiments of the goddess's grace. But within the high walls of the temples, their sanctity was often rewritten by men who believed that their touch was the will of heaven itself. These women lived at the trembling border between holiness and exploitation, adored, adorned, and ultimately consumed by the same divine fire they were sworn to serve. Their initiation began with purity. Selected from noble families or gifted lineages, these young girls were dedicated to the temple before they reached womanhood. They were taught that their lives belonged to the god, that their bodies were instruments of his pleasure and peace. They learned to dance not for men, but for eternity, every movement a symbol of divine energy, every gesture a prayer. The music that surrounded them was not mere entertainment, it was invocation, meant to awaken the deity's presence within the temple halls. When they sang, the gods were said to listen. When they moved, the gods were said to watch. But the eyes watching were not only divine. The high priests, custodians of these temples, held the power to define what was sacred. They decided which songs pleased the gods, which dances stirred their favor, and in the process, which maidens would be chosen to perform them in private chambers. The rituals that began as offerings soon took on another form, secret ceremonies of divine union, where the boundary between God and man vanished in candlelight. The priests claimed that through the maiden's body, the god himself entered the world. And so, what began as spiritual service became the justification for acts that no god ever demanded. The temple was a world of contrast. By day, the maidens walked in gardens perfumed with lotus and myrrh, their hair braided with gold threads, their laughter echoing softly among columns carved with hymns of purity. By night, the air grew heavy with incense and silence. Torches burned low as they entered the inner sanctum, carrying offerings, their bare feet leaving faint prints on the cool stone. There, before the statue of Ammonius or Hathor, they performed dances meant to mirror the union of divine forces, heaven and earth, god and goddess. The priest's chant would fill the room, his voice trembling with reverence and hunger. And in that charged stillness, the maiden ceased to be human, she became myth. Some believed this role was sacred, even envied it. To be chosen by the god was to be eternally blessed, marked for a destiny beyond ordinary life. But others knew the truth, that beneath the perfume of holiness lay fear, guilt, and confusion. They were told their bodies were holy, yet they were treated as vessels, their sanctity twisted to serve men's desires. Many of them lived their lives trapped between divine purpose and silent shame, unable to speak of what happened behind the veil. The punishment for revealing the temple's secrets was severe, exile at best, death at worst. And so, the truth remained sealed in silence, buried beneath centuries of worship. The contradictions of Egypt's faith magnified this tragedy. The goddess Hathor was both mother and lover, nurturing and sensual. Batet was both protector and temptress, symbol of fertility and ferocity. The women who served them were expected to embody these dualities perfectly, to be desirable yet untouchable, pure yet intoxicating. The priests saw them not as individuals, but as living symbols of cosmic order. To touch them was not lust, they claimed, but worship. To possess them was not sin, but fulfillment of divine law. In this way, morality bent beneath the weight of theology, and exploitation became sanctified through ritual language. The system that enabled these acts was carefully built. The high priests surrounded themselves with layers of ritual and secrecy. Each chamber of the temple had its hierarchy, servants, musicians, initiates, and those chosen for the mysteries. The maidens who entered the innermost chamber were told they were part of a sacred drama, the reenactment of creation itself. In their trance, they were to surrender their will to the god's embodiment. The priest, invoking the divine presence, would perform the ritual of union, a merging of mortal and immortal flesh. To outsiders, it was blasphemy. To the priest, it was transcendence. But power, once justified by divinity, has no limits. As centuries passed, the stories of divine brides multiplied. Some maidens were given titles of honor: beloved of Ammonius, hand of the goddess, servant of the sacred flame. Yet their titles often masked sorrow. A few left behind cryptic hymns, preserved in fragmented papyri, that speak not of ecstasy but of confusion and pain. One fragment, believed to be from a temple singer of Thebes, reads, "He said the god was within him. I saw only the man. Yet the god's shadow fell between us, and I could not flee." It is one of the few surviving voices from a world that demanded silence. The consequences of these forbidden unions were not only personal but spiritual. Many believed that such corruption invited divine wrath. When drought struck, or the Nile failed to flood, whispers spread that the gods were displeased. The purity of the temples, once Egypt's strength, had become its shame. The very women who were meant to embody divine grace became symbols of its loss. Some were accused of witchcraft, others quietly dismissed or vanished altogether. The rituals continued, but the belief began to rot from within. The gods who once smiled upon Egypt now seemed distant, perhaps because their worship had turned to sin. The story of these women is both tragic and profound. They were neither sinners nor saints, but instruments in a cosmic play written by men who mistook desire for divinity. Their bodies became battlegrounds where power and faith collided. And though history rarely records their names, their silence echoes through the ages, a haunting reminder of how easily holiness can become hunger, and how the purest intentions can be twisted by the darkest desires. By the end of this section, the temple no longer feels like a sanctuary. It feels like a gilded prison, filled with whispers of devotion and suppressed cries. The audience understands that Egypt's grandeur was built not only on stone and sunlight but on the quiet suffering of those who were told they were serving gods, when in truth, they were serving men. The beauty of the divine has begun to rot, and the corruption that began with the priests now consumes even the most innocent within the temple walls. There are moments in history when faith becomes so consuming that it dares to touch the realm of death. For the priests of ancient Egypt, desire and mortality were not opposites, they were twins. Both were doorways to the divine. In their endless pursuit to bridge the world of flesh and spirit, they created rituals where pleasure met decay, where life and death were not divided but joined in trembling union. These were the rites of rebirth, ceremonies that blurred the boundaries of morality and mortality, turning the human body into the stage for resurrection itself. To understand these rites, one must return to Egypt's oldest and most haunting myth, the story of Osiris. Betrayed and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, the god of life was cut into 14 pieces and scattered across the land. Isis, his devoted wife and sister, gathered his remains, weeping and praying until she restored him to life through an act of love so intimate that it defied death itself. From that union was born Horus, the Avenger, the living symbol of rebirth. To the Egyptian mind, this story was not myth but metaphysical truth, that creation required destruction, and resurrection required the union of body and soul. The priests of Ammonius and Osiris took this myth literally. They believed that by reenacting the divine reunion, they could harness the energy of life itself, the spark that animated gods and men alike. In secret chambers below the temples, these rites unfolded with an eerie blend of sensuality and sanctity. The air was heavy with incense and decay, walls adorned with scenes of resurrection, gods touching corpses, goddesses breathing life into the dead. The priests, robed in white and gold, chanted verses meant to awaken the Ka, the vital essence of the soul. But beneath the prayers was a deeper rhythm, the pulse of forbidden desire. For some initiates, the ultimate offering was not gold, not incense, but flesh. They believed that the god's spirit could enter a living body through acts of physical union, that death itself could be seduced. In certain temples of Abydos and Thebes, rituals were said to involve contact with the newly dead, the belief being that the last warmth of the body still carried divine energy. To merge with it, even symbolically, was to participate in the mystery of rebirth. Historians and anthropologists still debate the literal truth of these accounts, but the symbolism is unmistakable. To the Egyptian priest, life and death were lovers, eternally entwined. Mummification itself carried traces of this philosophy. When priests anointed the body, when they wrapped it in linen, they whispered prayers not just of farewell but of awakening. The embalming table was both an altar and a bed of transformation. Every gesture, the oils, the perfumes, the kisses upon the brow, echoed the myth of Isis restoring Osiris. Some texts even refer to the deceased as beloved of the goddess, as if death were not an end but a return to divine embrace. For the priests who performed these acts, death was the most intimate encounter with the sacred, and, perhaps, the most forbidden. Within the temples of Hathor, goddess of love and rebirth, this theology became physical theater. The dancers and singers who served her embodied both fertility and mortality. Their songs told of the body's decay and the soul's return, their movements symbolizing the struggle between pleasure and release. During certain night ceremonies, they were said to anoint their skin with oils used in mummification, their dance becoming an imitation of resurrection, sensual, hypnotic, terrifying in its beauty. It was believed that by invoking both death and desire, the temple could summon the god's presence to bless the land with fertility. But such rituals carried a cost. For every act of sacred renewal, there was an act of desecration. The priests' obsession with control over life and death drew them deeper into a darkness of their own making. What began as imitation of the gods became a parody of their power. There were whispers of ceremonies in which the high priest, possessed by divine mania, would drink from vessels filled with blood, believing it contained the essence of immortality. Others spoke of initiates buried alive for a night, their survival proof of divine favor. Some, it was said, did not return. The temple walls hid both miracles and madness. Psychologically, these rites reveal a terrifying truth about humanity. The closer one comes to divinity, the more one risks becoming monstrous. The high priests, surrounded by death, began to see themselves as masters of it. Their hands had touched the cold flesh of kings, had whispered the words that claimed to awaken the dead. Over time, the sanctity of life diminished. To them, death was no longer sacred. It was a tool, a veil to be torn apart. The body became an object of manipulation, a vessel for divine experimentation. In their hunger to transcend mortality, they began to lose their own humanity. As the rituals grew darker, the people outside the temples sensed something changing. Festivals once devoted to joy and renewal took on a grim tone. The processions of Osiris no longer celebrated the cycle of life, they mourned it. The smell of incense seemed heavier, almost funereal. Farmers whispered that the Nile's waters had grown cold. The gods, they said, were no longer listening. Perhaps the priests had gone too far, had invoked powers that were never meant to be called upon by mortal flesh. Inside the sanctuaries, however, the priests continued, convinced they were performing acts of cosmic importance. In their minds, they were not sinners, but saviors, maintaining the delicate balance of the universe through the mingling of life, death, and desire. Their reasoning was flawless, their faith unshakable, and their madness complete. The final image of this section is haunting and cinematic. A high priest standing before the mummified figure of a god-king, his hands trembling as he traces oil along the linen, his voice whispering prayers that sound more like longing than devotion. The torches flicker, the shadows dance like living spirits. Around him, the temple is silent except for the echo of his breath, a man trying to resurrect the divine through acts that defy both nature and morality. By the end of the rites of rebirth, the audience feels the collapse of boundaries between love and death, devotion and desecration. Egypt's priests have reached the height of forbidden power. They have not merely worshipped their gods, they have tried to become them. And in doing so, they have set in motion their own downfall. For those who attempt to control life and death inevitably awaken something neither God nor man can contain. The age of glory had begun to fade. The sands of Thebes, once heavy with the sound of ritual drums and sacred chants, grew quieter with each passing year. The temples that had gleamed like mirrors to the sun now stood half empty, their altars gathering dust. The gods, it seemed, had grown silent. And in that silence, Egypt began to tremble. The people whispered that something had gone wrong, that Ammonius, the hidden one, had turned his gaze away. The high priests, once the divine mediators between heaven and earth, now found themselves haunted by the weight of their own sins. The curse of desire had begun to unfold. The warning signs were subtle at first. The Nile's floods came late, or not at all. The harvests thinned. Animals refused to breed. The same rituals that once guaranteed abundance began to fail. The priests doubled their efforts, performing the rites of renewal with growing desperation. But the gods did not answer. Where once the air shimmered with divine presence, there was only emptiness. Some among the lower clergy whispered that the gods were punishing the priesthood itself, that their secret indulgences and forbidden rites had polluted the sanctity of the temples. These were dangerous words, and those who spoke them often vanished by morning. Within the temple hierarchy, fear bred paranoia. The high priests, who had long ruled with the confidence of immortals, began to suspect one another. Each disaster was seen as a sign of divine disfavor, and someone had to be blamed. Accusations of heresy and impurity spread through the sacred halls like plague. Lesser priests were interrogated, tortured, or expelled. Sacred maidens were dismissed or exiled, their silence purchased with threats and gold. The very institution that had bound Egypt together for millennia began to devour itself from within. In public, the high priests maintained their grandeur. They led processions in resplendent gold, their chants echoing across the city as though nothing had changed. But the people no longer looked at them with awe. They looked with suspicion, even hatred. Famine and drought had made the masses restless, and every failed harvest was blamed on the temple's corruption. The gods no longer hear you, one farmer was said to have shouted during a procession. You have buried them beneath your own sins. For the first time in living memory, a priest ordered the guards to silence him. It was a small moment, a single voice silenced by authority, but it marked the beginning of a rebellion not of swords, but of faith. The pharaoh, long overshadowed by the priesthood's power, seized this moment. In Thebes, the divine order that once placed the high priests beside kings began to fracture. Royal edicts demanded investigations into temple finances and rites. Gold was confiscated, temples audited, sacred lands reclaimed for the crown. The priests who had once manipulated pharaohs with oracles now found themselves accused of betrayal and impiety. Some were stripped of their titles, others forced to atone publicly, washing the temple steps in ritual humiliation. But the most powerful among them, those who had hidden behind the god's veil for too long, chose defiance. They claimed persecution, insisting that Pharaoh himself had grown faithless. They called for purification through greater sacrifice, promising that blood could restore the god's favor. Their ceremonies became darker, more frenzied. In torchlit sanctuaries, the priests anointed themselves with sacred oils and recited invocations meant to open the mouths of the gods. Yet what emerged from those chambers was not salvation but terror. Witnesses spoke of priests trembling uncontrollably, of voices that spoke in unknown tongues, of flames that seemed to burn without heat. Whether madness or miracle, none could tell. But even among believers, fear replaced reverence. The temples that had once glowed with divine promise now stank of decay and despair. Among the people, stories spread of divine retribution. Some said the goddess Hathor wept blood. Others swore that the eyes of Ammonius' statue no longer reflected light. Strange omens filled the sky. Eclipses, storms, the sudden deaths of sacred animals. The old balance, the sacred ma'at that had kept Egypt's soul aligned for thousands of years, was collapsing. The moral order itself was unraveling. Even the priests began to wonder if they had gone too far, if their pleasures, their arrogance, their attempt to possess the gods had finally drawn divine wrath upon them. The temples, once seen as ladders to heaven, had become tombs. In the private chambers of the last high priest of Ammonius, records tell of nights filled with terror. He could not sleep. He claimed to hear whispers in the darkness, voices of the gods he had once called upon, now accusing him. He dreamed of rivers running red, of statues melting into flesh, of the sacred maidens he had used appearing before him with hollow eyes. Each morning he awoke drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his lips still murmuring the name of Ammonius, but no answer came. The god he had served so fanatically was gone, or perhaps had never been there at all. Only silence remained. Eventually the pharaoh struck back. He sent soldiers into Thebes, declaring the temple's corruption an affront to the divine. The gates of Karnak were sealed. Priests were dragged from their sanctuaries, their robes torn, their treasures seized. The greatest temple in the world became a prison for its own masters. Some priests chose suicide over disgrace, drinking hemlock or cutting their veins before the altars they had once consecrated. Others fled into the desert, convinced that they could still find Ammonius' spirit among the sands. None were ever heard from again. And yet, even in destruction, there lingered tragedy. These men had not set out to defy the gods. They had sought to draw nearer to them, to understand the mysteries of creation, to touch eternity. But in doing so, they had forgotten what it meant to be mortal. Their fall was not just punishment, it was a return to human frailty. As the fires of their temples smoldered and the statues cracked, Egypt was left with a haunting truth. The closer man comes to God, the more catastrophic his fall. The section closes on a stark, cinematic image, the temple of Ammonius in ruin, its columns half buried in drifting sand. The wind moves through the empty corridors like the breath of the gods departing. A single priest, stripped of his robes, kneels before the shattered statue of Ammonius, whispering, "We only wanted to serve." His voice breaks as he looks up into the eyeless face of the god, and in that hollow gaze, he sees not judgment, but reflection. The gods had not cursed them, they had merely shown them what they truly were. By the end of this chapter, the divine order of Egypt lies in ruins. The priests who once claimed to channel immortality have become symbols of decay. The curse of desire has come full circle, not as divine wrath, but as consequence. It was not the gods who turned away, it was humanity that lost itself in its hunger for holiness. The fall of the high priests is not the end of Egypt's faith, but its reckoning, a warning that even in the holiest of hearts, the seeds of corruption wait patiently to bloom. There is a moment in every civilization when it must face the reflection of its own soul, and for Egypt, that moment came not through war, but through silence. When the temples fell and the chants ceased, what remained was the echo of human nature laid bare. The story of the high priests of Ammonius was not only one of power and lust, it was a psychological revelation, a study of how sanctity, when pressed too tightly, warps into sin. In this chapter, we step beyond the walls of Karnak and into the deeper chambers of the human mind, where holiness and perversion are not enemies, but shadows of the same impulse. Why do the pure so often become the perverse? It is a question that history repeats in whispers across centuries, from the temples of Thebes to the monasteries of medieval Europe. The answer lies not in religion, but in repression. The high priests lived under impossible expectations. They were meant to embody the gods, flawless, emotionless, vessels of divine order. To feel desire was to betray that perfection. But desire cannot be killed, it can only be buried. And when buried long enough, it festers, transforming into something darker. The more they denied the flesh, the more it haunted them. Every vow of purity became a temptation. Every ritual of restraint became a rehearsal for indulgence. The Egyptian priesthood psychology was shaped by paradox. Their religion demanded balance, Ma'at, the eternal order. Yet their own lives were built on imbalance. Total control on the outside, total chaos within. Day after day, they touched symbols of fertility, recited hymns of love and creation, and performed rituals invoking divine union, while being forbidden from experiencing those same forces as human beings. In suppressing their nature, they became slaves to it. The forbidden did not repel them. It seduced them, precisely because it was forbidden. This transformation was gradual, invisible. A man does not wake one morning and decide to corrupt the sacred. It begins with rationalization, the quiet voice that says, "The gods made me this way." The priests convinced themselves that their desires were divine impulses, that indulgence was not rebellion but fulfillment of cosmic law. After all, If the gods themselves knew pleasure, why should their servants not share in it? This is how sin was reborn as sanctity, not through blasphemy, but through logic. Power accelerated the delusion. The high priests of Ammonius wielded near-absolute control over Egypt's spiritual and economic life. When one holds such power and believes it sanctioned by heaven, moral boundaries dissolve. Every act becomes righteous, every whim a revelation. Psychologists call this moral licensing, the belief that doing good gives one permission to do evil. For the priests, every prayer, every offering, every act of devotion became credit toward their indulgences. They had earned their sins through their holiness. And once that justification took root, the descent was inevitable. But beneath the layers of ritual and authority, there was fear. The priests lived in constant dread of impurity, of punishment, of divine abandonment. Their entire identity was built on control of emotion, of body, of destiny. To lose that control was to lose themselves. Yet paradoxically, they longed for release. The forbidden rites, the sensual ceremonies, the acts of possession, these were not merely indulgences, they were escapes. In those moments of frenzy, when the gods supposedly entered their body, they could surrender their burdens. The ecstasy of transgression was their only freedom. It is here that the psychology of holiness reveals its most dangerous secret. The pursuit of purity can become the most powerful form of obsession. To destroy desire, one must constantly think about it. To suppress sin, one must give it attention. And so the priests, in their endless war against temptation, became defined by it. Their religion, instead of protecting them from corruption, made them its architects. The temple that was meant to elevate the soul became a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of the human heart. Anthropologically, this pattern repeats across civilizations. In every society where power and sanctity converge, corruption follows. Not because faith is evil, but because the act of claiming divinity warps the mind. To stand as the voice of the gods is to stand above consequence, and nothing corrodes morality faster than the absence of accountability. The Egyptian priesthood became a psychological experiment in what happens when humans believe they can transcend their nature. Their fall was not born from ignorance, but from hubris, the belief that they could rewrite the laws of both heaven and flesh. Even in their downfall, there was a strange beauty, a tragic echo of human yearning. The priests were not monsters, they were dreamers who tried to touch eternity. They sought to merge with the divine, to dissolve the boundaries between man and God, to find immortality in sensation. Their sin was not that they desired too much, but that they mistook desire for enlightenment. They chased transcendence through the body instead of through the soul. And in doing so, they rediscovered the one truth that no civilization escapes, that divinity cannot be forced and holiness cannot be faked. The collapse of the priesthood, then, was not merely a historical event. It was a psychological reckoning, the human mind turning upon itself. As the temples crumbled, so too did the illusions that sustained them. The same priests who once claimed to channel the gods now faced their reflection and saw only men, frightened, fragile, and lost. Their downfall was not divine punishment, it was self-recognition. In the end, they were undone not by blasphemy, but by honesty. The section closes on a reflective tone. The narrator's voice slows, almost mournful, describing a lone initiate sweeping the temple floor long after the gods have left. Dust swirls in the sunlight, and for a brief moment, it looks like smoke rising from the remnants of ritual fires. The voiceover says softly, in their pursuit of purity, they found corruption. In their search for the divine, they found themselves. And perhaps that was the gods' final lesson, that what we call holiness is only the shadow of our hunger to be more than human. By the end, the audience is left not in horror, but in contemplation. The story of Egypt's high priests becomes a mirror for the human condition, our eternal struggle between faith and flesh, between the dream of godhood and the weight of our mortality. The forbidden history has transformed into something timeless, a meditation on why every civilization that builds temples to purity must eventually watch them fall. The desert wind moves softly across the ruins of Thebes, carrying with it the dust of centuries. The temples that once glowed under the sun now lie half-buried, their columns cracked, their inscriptions fading into silence. The gods who once ruled the hearts of men have vanished into myth, their names surviving only as echoes carved in stone. Yet, as the camera lingers over these desolate remains, a single question rises from the dust. What became of those who touched the divine and fell? The story of Egypt's high priests does not end with their destruction, it ends with revelation. The centuries that followed their downfall transformed Egypt from the realm of gods to the realm of memory. The faith that once animated its people gave way to new empires, new beliefs, and new masters. The temples were looted, the idols shattered, and the golden barks of Ammonius burned for their metal. But even as their monuments crumbled, something of the priests' legacy endured, a lesson written not in hieroglyphs, but in the psyche of humanity. The Egyptians had not simply worshipped their gods, they had sought to become them. That longing, that ancient hunger to transcend the flesh, still lingers in us. The story of the high priests is not dead history. It is the story of us all. In the ruins of Karnak, archaeologists have found traces of rituals that still defy explanation, rooms designed with impossible precision for sound resonance, altars aligned perfectly with the stars, murals depicting men and gods in acts of unity so intimate they blur into abstraction. These remnants are not mere relics, they are psychological maps of the human spirit. They remind us that beneath every religion, every empire, lies the same obsession, to conquer the limits of mortality. The priests of Ammonius may have cloaked their desire in holiness, but their true ambition was eternal, to touch the divine and never return. The narrator's tone deepens, contemplative yet haunting. Every civilization that rises to greatness eventually seeks to immortalize itself. Egypt built pyramids to preserve kings, temples to preserve gods, and rituals to preserve the soul. But immortality, once pursued, always demands a price. The priests learned that to claim godhood is to lose humanity, and that no ritual, no matter how sacred, can separate the two. Their temples fell because they tried to build heaven on earth, mistaking divine mystery for possession. In their arrogance, they forgot that the divine cannot be owned, it can only be glimpsed. As the story nears its end, the camera moves through the temple of Luxor at dusk. The stones glow red under the dying sun, and the narrator speaks of reflection, of how civilizations fall not because of their gods, but because of their hearts. The forbidden desires of the high priests were not aberrations, they were confessions. Their rituals, their excesses, their lust for immortality, all were expressions of the same truth, that human beings are drawn irresistibly to the flame that can destroy them. Desire, after all, is the oldest form of worship. The moral reflection grows deeper. What if the gods they served were never external beings, but manifestations of their own inner hunger? The god Ammonius, the hidden one, may have been more than a deity. He may have been the shadow of the human soul itself, invisible yet omnipresent, whispering its temptations through the corridors of the mind. When the priests claimed to channel Ammonius, perhaps they were listening to their own desires echoed back at them. In that sense, their downfall was not divine punishment, but a mirror, showing humanity that the line between holiness and hubris is written in the heart. The documentary transitions into a modern tone. Images of bustling cities, churches, temples, and digital screens flash across the montage. The narrator reminds us that the legacy of the high priests still breathes in every age that tries to moralize desire. Even today, we build temples of purity, political, religious, ideological, and fill them with people who claim to speak for something higher than themselves. Yet, behind every altar, there is still the same secret struggle, the war between restraint and hunger, faith and flesh. The priests of Ammonius are long dead, but their shadows move through us every time power and sanctity intertwine. In this final reflection, the tone becomes almost poetic, both mournful and transcendent. The forbidden desires of the ancient priests were not simply sins of flesh, they were reflections of an unending human paradox. To be human is to crave transcendence, to reach for something greater, even when it destroys us. The priests' tragedy was that they mistook transcendence for indulgence, mistook the divine for their own reflection. But their story endures because it reveals something that no time can erase, that the divine and the damned are born from the same flame. As the final scene unfolds, the camera drifts through the shattered colonnades of Karnak under the moonlight. The wind hums through the hollow stone like a forgotten hymn. The narrator's voice fades into a whisper. Once, they believed the gods lived among them. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the gods were never above, but within, hidden behind the masks we wear, waiting for us to see that in our desire to touch heaven, we have already become its shadow. The music swells, soft, mournful strings that blend with the desert wind. The image fades to black, leaving only the sound of distant chanting, echoing from a past that refuses to die. The audience is left not with judgment, but with awe, a haunting awareness that the line between worship and sin, purity and desire, holiness and hunger, has never truly been erased. In the end, the most forbidden desires of ancient Egypt's high priests that went too far becomes more than a story of decadence. It becomes a meditation on human nature itself, on the eternal truth that the pursuit of the divine is never innocent, and that even the holiest hearts burn with the same forbidden fire. The gods did not abandon Egypt. They remain, carved in our very instincts, whispering through every age. To know the divine, you must first face the darkness within.